Hey guys, this is just a short series I want to make. Trying to make some quick videos giving summaries of Jewish history and how it fulfills Abraham's promise from God. This first video will just be showing how God used Abram and sent him through all these old civilizations. Hope you enjoy it. Leave some comments for me. Tell me what you would like to see different, and we'll try to get through it, make them good. Okay. So the focus, God spoke to Abram and promised in Genesis 12 that all nations would be blessed through Abram. Now, what's cool to me about this is the entire Bible, like Genesis 1 through 11, is summing up the creation of the world, Noah, Tower of Babel, all these things. And then from Genesis 12 forward, it's basically following the Jews and the story of the Jews through Jesus Christ. Now, yes, Genesis 1, I would argue, is about Jesus as well. But it's very cool that it seems like God didn't waste a whole lot of time with the creation of everything. He wanted to get straight to the point of here's the focus. So what did this promise actually mean? God created a people group for the purpose of showing God's character, His plan, His expectations, and the means of salvation through this people group. The Jews were often held to a different standard than that of their neighbors. So when you see people saying, when you get modern arguments about, well, what about Levitical law? Well, you're not a Jew. So that's usually the very basic answer is most of us are not Jewish people. We weren't held to that specific standard God had for that specific group. Not everything in the Old Testament is meant to be replicated or practiced because God had a specific purpose for His Hebrew nation. And God used Abram to create a Hebrew people in order to bring Jesus through this group to bless the entire world. The whole point of the Jews is to bring Jesus. And if you can get that from the very beginning with Abram, the rest of it's very cool. Just a quick side note about the Jews. I'm not going to read all of this on this slide. If you want to pause and read, you can. But the main point is that if you follow the history of the Jews, you will find that they are interacting with pretty much every world power in history. We'll see in a moment how Abram might have actually interacted with India, even if he didn't later on after the diaspora, after Jesus, when Jews are spread throughout the world. Jews do go to India, China, Europe, Africa, and they are spread throughout all the world, even to modern day in America. Everywhere you can find Jews or people of Jewish ancestry or some kind of mixture of Jew. Okay, if we look at someone like Jonah in the Old Testament, it's very cool to see that Jonah got on a ship with guys who were Canaanite but worshiped different gods. Now maybe these were just Jews that didn't believe in God, but realistically they're probably the Phoenicians, because we know throughout world history no one really knows who the Phoenicians are besides that they're Canaanite, and we know that they were great sailors. And you may not know this, but the city Jonah was trying to go to, is in modern day Spain. That's cool to me, man. From the beginning, there were nations everywhere. People were on ships sailing, going to these places. So to go from Israel to the very tip of Europe, that's as far as Jonah could think to go. Okay, we'll see the Jews interact with Babylon, Assyria, Egypt mostly, and in the New Testament, the Romans. Outside the Bible, you do hear about the Greeks in history, on into the Mongols, the Muslim nations, all kinds of things. But the main point I'd say is to ignore the Jewish history is to ignore a key part of God's plan throughout all of human history. So here's the promise. Now I have two different versions, King James and NIV. And you can read either one here if you want to pause and read or think about it. But this is the core scripture from this whole little series I'm going to make. So it says in chapter 12, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And here it is. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. If you look at the NIV version, down at verse 3, bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So this original promise, God comes to Abram in his hometown and says, I will make a nation from you. What is the purpose? The purpose of this nation is to bless all people. The Bible has never been exclusively for the Jews. From the very beginning of the Jewish nation, they were meant to be the blessing for all nations. Now, where's Abram's country of origin? If you can see this map, let's see if I can do a marky mark here. Right here is Ur. If you see me circling that, down here on the bottom. Ur is one of many cities, and it's in modern day Iraq. If you look up here, here's Ur. There's Baghdad, which is the capital of Iraq today. Baghdad is basically Babylon. But you'll notice the difference in the modern day map and the old map is Ur looks further from the water today. So back in the old day, Ur was closer to the Gulf, and people have suggested Ur was very rich, and they actually did trade with people in India. Now the old Indian civilization is actually in modern day Pakistan, but the Indus Valley, there were people over there. So it is possible that Abram was aware of people in India, and not to mention all these other cities like Uruk. If you're a history nerd, you may have heard of Uruk or Larsa. Probably none of these other ones, maybe Kish, but they're all in this river valley civilization. And my main point in showing this map is to show you that there's nothing very significant about picking one man from one city. In these very first civilizations that the world knows about, there were cities everywhere. They were very organized. They had these huge governments, had infrastructure, big cities. They built temples, had hundreds of gods, had trade and commerce. They were moving across the ocean and across the deserts all the way over to Egypt to trade. This is a very organized thing. So it's not a bunch of people sitting out in the desert as we tend to think. Okay, it's very organized. There's all kinds of cities, all kinds of cultures. Okay, so from another map, you see Ur is still down here where he was to begin with. Turn a little map there. Now, a lot of people don't know about the Elamites, and there's a city named Susa. Some people would say these are a different group than the Elamites, but there's more people over here, even within this little river valley, Euphrates, Tigris. There's a lot of different languages, a lot of groups. Here's Nineveh up here, which will become the Assyrians. Haran, which is where Abram, he'll follow kind of up this river here, Euphrates, and come up here to Haran, and then down into Israel. Hittites would eventually be up here with other groups, the Greeks, and Egypt down here. So a lot of stuff going on, and Abraham's going through all of it. Okay, so Ur was a rich city with port access to Africa, India. Some say even further. Maybe that's suggesting China. I don't know. Abram grew up in a wealthy place with all the world's ideas, gods, and goods. This would not have been an ignorant man. Abram traveled, including his march down to Egypt, about 2,200 miles from Ur to Egypt and then back to Canaan. You could argue 2,000 to 2,500 miles. Either way, most of us have never walked a fraction of that. Some of us actually have never traveled that far around the world. So this guy got to see most of the known world in his lifetime. Along this path that most people believe he took, and the Bible shows some of this, he would have traveled through almost all the major cities of Mesopotamia. He would have seen the worship of hundreds of gods. He would have seen mighty nations ruled by mighty kings from our history books. And this is the cool part. And yet, he would do this as an old man without even one son. And God has told him, you are going to be a mighty nation that has so many descendants we can't count. And then God proceeds to make him walk through all the mighty nations on earth and let him see them. That's cool to me, okay? Abram had the opportunity to see what the world had to offer before God allowed him to move forward with his own nation that God was going to make. Here's another map showing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's maps. I'm not going to stay here. If you want to pause later and look at this, you can. But just notice that's why they're going around. There's a desert in the middle. Okay. All right. Now, from a historic view, Abram, the first Hebrew, already had contact with the known world. God allowed him to see what would be Babylon, Assyria, Syria, Israel, and Egypt. You could argue some other ones if you want. And feel free in comments, anything, to correct me or add things to this. Like I said, this is very quick. I'm trying to be as quick as I can, and we're already at 11 minutes. Okay. He gave up being a part of his father's land. He gave up the opportunity to stop in any of the major cities along the way, make a name for himself, and he kept marching on for hundreds of miles to be obedient to God. Now, do you think God was teaching him something through this? And why would God choose this particular man at this particular time period and ask him to move far away to a specific place? Okay, very cool. Why would any of this matter? Because some of you are watching, if you haven't stopped yet, and said, "Oh, I don't really care about the history of it." So this is what I would say. The deeper you dig into history and the Bible, the more you will see a rich world full of different people, cultures, and beliefs. And even in Matthew, it tells us to go into all the world, all the nations. And I feel like as Christians should have an obligation to care about nations and cultures and reach out to those peoples. All of this is happening in the first known recorded civilizations. Abram traveled further in his life and saw more things than many of us ever will. And Abram got to see the trappings of power. He got to meet Pharaoh. Okay? The highest forms of power of his time, and he knew that God had told him that he would have a greater nation than any of them. That would be hard to imagine, considering Abram's already an old man with no kids. God was already preparing a story that included all the world in his plan from the very beginning. Seeing the bigger picture. Last one here, and we'll be done. What really got me thinking about this was reading in John when Jesus was confronted about Abraham, and it clicked with me that obviously Jesus is God, and I read the story of Abram and realize God is speaking to him and is friends with him, and God is Jesus. So it's funny to imagine someone telling Jesus what Abraham would think when Jesus was the one who made Abraham. He made the plan for Abraham. He actually talked to Abraham and was friends with him. So in John 8, the Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" They've just called Jesus a half-breed demon. Okay? Which we get into the Samaritans later, why it's so important for the Jews to remain Jewish. But verse 49, Jesus answered, "I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. You're crazy. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died? Who do you make yourself out to be?" And here Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word." Right here, boom. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Jesus right here in the New Testament is saying, I'm older than Abraham. I knew Abraham. Abraham knew about this promise, and he saw it and was glad to know that a Savior of the world was going to come through his bloodline. That's cool, guys. If you can get that mindset reading the Old Testament, move through it following the Jewish people's stories. It's not really the Jewish people's story. It is the world. It's all people's story of salvation, and that's why it's so cool and interesting. If you've liked this video, let me know. If you want shorter videos, 5-6 minute videos, where we break down small things. But I want to go through kind of the history of the Jews. Especially I want to get through Moses and the book of Judges and explain kind of the parallels with salvation and how we get to Jesus, and especially get to how Jesus is actually fulfilling all these Jewish prophecies and the promise, Abraham's promise to bless all people. All right. Thank you.